just a moment, I'll be looking at today's papers with Alpesh Patel, Chief Executive of Perfidium Partners, primed and ready to go. Good to have you in the studio, Alpesh. But let's first take a moment and look back at some past Olympics. In 1988, New Zealander Mark Todd went to Seoul as defending gold medalist in the three-day eventing. But many doubted he could carry off another victory. His beloved horse Charisma was small for an eventer and by then was getting on in age. But as he told us for today's postcard, his confidence was strangely undented.
Seoul was a slightly strange Olympics, because it was in a pretty foreign country, and it certainly had no horse background really, but they'd built a specialist racing complex there, and so the facilities were actually amazing. And leading up to Seoul, there was a lot of talk that the horse at 16 years old was past his best, and that maybe he shouldn't be going, and that my younger horse Balua was probably a better bet. But I was pretty confident, so I went to Seoul in a very positive frame of mind and believed that the horse was as good as he ever had been. Riding the horse there, he just felt absolutely amazing. I don't think I'd ever had him as good. He went into the dressage and he won that quite comfortably. So basically he led the competition from start to the end. In the cross country he gave me a fantastic ride. He had the fastest time. And by the time we came to the show jumping, which was quite often his weak point, I think we had 2 or 3 rail advantage over the next competitor. And although he had one fence down, again, he still won pretty convincingly. And it was a very, very satisfying, probably even more so than winning at LA, because, as I say, we'd gone there slightly as underdogs, people doubting that the horse was as good as he had been, doubting that I should have taken him there, and went there and proved everybody wrong and won it in absolutely convincing style. So it was a brilliant result for me.
Mark Todd recalling how he proved the skeptics wrong and retained his 3-day eventing Olympic title, and I had the pleasure of meeting him. He's a terrific guy. Now we have lots more great memories from great sportsmen in our Olympic postcard series. It's now time to take a look at what's making newspaper headlines around the world. The South China Morning Post leads with the news of the defection of the Syrian Prime Minister Riyad Hijab from the Assad government to the Syrian opposition. Touchdown is the image on the front of the Gulf News showing the safe arrival of NASA's Curiosity space rover on Mars early on Monday. One of Britain's most distinguished banks, Standard Chartered, has been accused by U.S. regulators of laundering $250 billion for Iran. That's the story leading The Independent. Facebook begins its venture into the world of online gambling from today, reports the Financial Times. Users in the UK will be offered the opportunity to play online bingo for cash prizes. Australia loses bragging rights in the International Herald Tribune. It highlights the country in which Olympic champions used to grow on eucalyptus trees, and it's now slumped badly on the Olympic medal table. But Britain continues its golden run at the Games with Olympic joy for the men's equestrian show jumpers, including 54-year-old Nick Skelton and 52-year-old Peter Charles. So there's still hope for the rest of us. To discuss these, I'm joined by Alpesh Patel, Chief Executive of Perfidium Partners. How are you, Alpesh?
I'm very good indeed.
It's great to have you in the studio.
Thank you.
We'll get to the sports in a moment, but seriously, focusing on this very serious issue, the situation in Syria. What kind of impact do you think the defection of the Prime Minister will have?
I think this is a huge story, not least because look at the quote that the South China Morning Post has gone with. What the Prime Minister said after defecting is, my defection is from the terrorist regime. He specifically used the term terrorist in terms of the regime that he has left. That makes, logic dictates, that makes China and Russia state sponsors of terrorism. That is what the former Prime Minister of Syria is calling those two countries. And yet, China and Russia win as many medals as you want, but they are propping up a terrorist regime.
Well, you would expect him to say that as he leaves the role in government, but one wonders that in the absence of any movement in diplomacy, it could appear that this would just end up as a fight to the finish. There is no other story in town.
Prime ministers don't defect without darn good reason, and then he's one in a long line of diplomats and politicians who've left. Hopefully, this will be the tipping point for China and Russia. Their position is becoming increasingly embarrassing for themselves and untenable. This may well be the tipping point. I hope it is. And I think it's a far bigger story than some of the papers are at the moment picking up on. But it is front page news on the South China Morning Post.
All right, front page news in the Gulf news is a story that broke when we were on air around this time yesterday. The Mars rover, picture-perfect touchdown. What came to mind when you saw that?
Well, I worked out the cost to get there was $5 per kilometer. It's about as economical as my car. $5 per given current petrol prices.
Environmentalists won't be pleased to hear that, Alpesh.
Look, I'm really delighted. This is the spirit of adventure. It's discovery. The slight thing I was disappointed about was President Obama's speech. He makes great speeches. What he said is, the United States of America made history today on the planet of Mars. Now, in 1969, and this wasn't a manned mission to Mars, but in 1969, when the first man landed on the moon, the United States graciously said this was a giant leap for mankind. This time, he mentioned just the United States. I hope he reverts back to the fact that the Americans have done this for all mankind.
Perhaps a little bit of a morale booster for NASA that's been going through some difficult times right now. And now we have the Independence, a British bank accused of laundering $250 billion for the Iranian regime. These are allegations that the bank has denied, but still a blow nevertheless.
Well, allegations by the US regulators out of the New York branch, which is accused of doing this, which makes me think, what on earth were the American regulators doing? $250 billion over a prolonged period of time from a major bank, if the allegations are correct, makes you think that it's a massive regulatory failure. It'll be interesting to see whether they get a slap wrist with a fine or there will be criminal prosecutions, because something as big as this, there should be criminal prosecutions. There were none of the bankers during the credit crunch, so the Americans have been a little bit shy at taking criminal prosecutions against bankers. It'll be interesting to see if they bother doing it this time, or whether this is just a ploy to get some fine money into the regulators' coffers.
Let's move on to the Financial Times, and on its companies and markets page, news that Facebook is branching out into gambling, online gambling, and in Britain it's going to be, well, bingo.
Smacks of desperation. I'll tell you what, the reason Facebook exists is for that. So you and I can post pictures of things like the Olympic Stadium to make people jealous. But that doesn't earn Facebook any money.
Right.
And advertisers aren't generating enough money. That's why the share price is down about 50% from when it floated a couple of months ago.
Yes.
So how do you make money? Well, gambling is one way because people transact through things like bingo. But the problem with that is there's very few countries in which that's actually legal. And so it's going to make no difference to the share price. Something you've got to do, you've got to try, and hopefully it'll earn a little bit. But it'll make no difference to that 50% slump because they can't generate the revenues.
Okay, we only have a few seconds left, so I'm going to jump to The Guardian, and you have what they're calling golden oldies, some great news for some equestrian jumpers, but it gives, I suppose, hope to the rest of us, doesn't it?
Hey, you and I, we're signing up for Rio in 2016. We're going to be out there because if those guys can do it, we're actually too young to do it.
Beach volleyball?
Yeah, well, I consider that a spectator sport.
Alpesh Patel of Perfidion Partners, many thanks. That's where we're going to leave it for now. More news coming up shortly.